The book departs, Andy, from the question selected by Bordeaux's Royal Academy of Sciences for its 1741 prize essay competition. This is the question. What is the physical cause of the Negro's color, the quality of the Negro's hair, and the degeneration of both Negro hair and skin? And what you argue that the Academy is really asking behind this is, as the name of your book suggests, who is Black and why? Furthermore, what did being Black at this time signify? And I think it's important to contextualize this question in three ways. The first way is to ask you to tell us what is Bordeaux's Royal Academy of Sciences? What is it? Who are the members? And what does it hope to achieve by posing these broad questions with huge cash prizes?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me tonight. This has always been a kind of a desire of mine to come to the library. I've heard a lot about it, but it's actually my first time inside the library. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the book, how the book came about, I think, and then I'm going to get to the Academy, what the Academy is and who the people are and why they would ask this very strange question. The first thing I should probably say is that I did this, of course, with Henry Louis Gates Jr., and the project was actually his idea. I'd written about this in an earlier book called The Anatomy of Blackness, which alluded to this contest. And I had found these manuscripts in the Bordeaux archives in probably 2008 or 2009. And I found them to be just absolutely astonishing. The first thing that I need to say about them is that they had the contest, but they never gave a prize, which is why they were really unknown. And they sat around in the archives for 280 years. So I saw them as really critical to the kind of overall story of the history of race. And the history of race is something that we don't really know about as a kind of community because it's a tough story to tell. It's full of stereotypes and racism and so on and so forth. But it's an idea. Race is an idea that was invented in the 18th century. And this contest was really a part of that because it's the first time that a scientific academy said or really claimed the right to decide what a subspecies of humans was and what it meant. So this is a really kind of a critical thing. I can see people's eyes going, what? Racism, what I'm talking about is a biologically determined racism in the 18th century. It's when heredity is combined with the idea of destiny. It's when there's a physiological kind of idea of what certain people are and what they're worth and what they will become and what their political status is. It's very different from xenophobia, very different from slavery. Xenophobia and slavery have been around forever, probably. But this is a different thing when human beings are categorized. Now to get to your questions a little bit. So who is this Bordeaux Academy? The Bordeaux Academy is, first thing, we think of academies as being associated with educational institutions. Academies, universities. In the 18th century, academies are very different from universities. Universities, we were saying before the talk started, universities are in the 18th century in the business of replicating knowledge and definitely not inventing knowledge. So it's a finishing school for lawyers, doctors, and theologians, priests. And they were not in the business of coming up with ideas having to do with race. And this brings me to a little kind of digression here, if you allow me.
In the spirit of Diderot.
Universities and academies were set up almost in opposition to universities in that they were almost like social clubs, but they freed themselves from the constraints of universities. They were not in the business of replicating knowledge. They were in the business of creating knowledge. So that's what was going on here. And the members, I think was your final question, who are the members of the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences? Well, for example, Montesquieu was a member. Voltaire was a corresponding member of the Bordeaux Academy of Sciences. And this is a Royal Academy of Science, so it has the king's kind of stamp on it after 1713. And there were kind of two branches or two groups within the academy. There were people called des membres ordinaires, who were paradoxically the aristocracy, members of parliament, the people who really ran Bordeaux, about 20 of them. And another 20 were people who actually had expertise in something. They didn't have as much political power. They might be engineers, not merchants, but engineers or other tradespeople who were invested in the sciences, naturalists, etc. So there's two different groups here. And you alluded to the interest in physical explanations. This is part of an overall shift that takes place in the 18th century from theological explanations of everything, including human beings, to more secular and scientific things. And that's one of the things that happens that allows this contest to take place and also that allows race to take place. Big answer, sorry.
No, fantastic. And I think I pulled this from your introduction. I think it highlights the first point you were making about what do we mean by the invention of race in the 18th century. You write that we hope that this book will help its audience understand how Enlightenment era naturalists progressively transformed the alleged cognitive and physical differences existing among the world's people into normalized categories, taxonomical schemes that positioned white Europeans at the pinnacle of a fixed racial hierarchy.
Yes, so that's a summary of kind of what happens over the course of the century. I've been looking at this kind of question 3 different ways. The first time I did it, I was just wondering, where the hell did race come from? And so I just spent a lot of time thinking like an 18th century writer and thinker, and I went back and I read all the travel logs to all the different parts of the world, hundreds of travel logs. And then before kind of science takes off, I read the travel logs. And then, the 1720s, 1730s, we start seeing naturalists becoming more and more interested in the travel logs. The travel logs produce the kind of matière brute, I'm speaking in French now, the base material for race, the basic kind of ethnographic stereotypes and so on and so forth. The naturalists will take this and start working with this. And one of the things they're thinking about, not yet taxonomy, they're thinking about where people came from. What is the where did they come from and what are the explanations? And there's 2 major explanations during the 18th century. One is monogenesis, which is compatible with the Bible, and one is polygenesis. What is monogenesis? Monogenesis is the idea that there's an original prototype race, or group of people, I should say, presumably white, and we can get back to that in a while, that over time moves into different climates, and in these different climates changes, degenerates, color changes, other things change. And this is the first kind of physical explanation. You'll notice that it is compatible with the Bible, as I said. If you think about Noah's Ark landing in the Caucasus, it's not a coincidence that white is associated with being Caucasian, right? So Noah's Ark lands in the Caucasus. His 3 boys get out, and there's Shem, Japheth, and Ham. And unfortunately, Ham, Noah gets drunk and doesn't get in trouble for that. But Ham sees Noah naked, as Noah's drunk and naked, and Ham is cursed. Or actually, Ham's descendants are cursed, and they are cursed to become servants of servants. And what happens is that the Bible doesn't say anything about Ham's descendants becoming black, but within the biblical exegesis and theologians later on will start saying that Ham's descendants were blackened and cursed and destined to be servants of servants. Still in all, that story is a monogenetic story. It's one group of people that become many groups of people, right? So that's one of the things that's so interesting about this, that one of the first explanations about humans were compatible with the Bible. To say that different humans came into being separately is incredibly heretical, which is why Voltaire loved doing it. Voltaire, super anti-clerical, he is going to say that the different races are like different kinds of trees. They're, you've got a pear tree, you've got an apple tree, and you've got a maple. They're not from the same seed, my friends. So we can get into Voltaire a little bit later too, but there's the big tension going on in the 18th century, trying to figure that out and figure out what happened to make human diversity. Paradoxically, if you think about the monogenetic idea, it's the exact opposite of the out of Africa thesis that we've accepted now, that all humans came out of East Africa more or less 100,000 years ago. The white-centered explanation is clearly that all different kinds of humans came out of original white prototype.
So this is great, Andy, because it gets to the third piece of context that I wanted to get to. We'll get back to the second piece of context, but the third context is why this question. And apart from these two strains of thought that you just outlined, there's also, you point out, this question inscribes in, you say it's the latest iteration of a 2,000-year-old fascination with the causes of dark skin. Can you talk about how this kind of question is really not new, although possibly these diverging paths are?
Yeah, it's true that, I think that people of African descent and Africans were fascinated with human diversity in the same way the Chinese were fascinated by human diversity. There's been different explanations been floating around for a long time. In the Western tradition, we think about Hippocrates, and we think of mainly Hippocrates and climatological explanations for different types of people. Hippocrates, great Greek doctor and theorist of many different things, is going to talk about the fact that if you move into a different climate, things are going to happen to you, and particularly your humors are going to be affected. And he said that people in hot climates would have bile rather. You could, in French we say on se fait de la bile. These ideas are with us. We're melancholic and so on and so forth. And black bile produces melancholy. Later on, they'll talk about Africans as having black bile, quite literally, and being melancholy in the colonies. Well, there's a lot of other reasons for being melancholy in the colonies other than your bile. So this tradition, you're right, has been going on for a long time. And in the 17th century, there's more and more people thinking about this, but it's kind of soft and it's anecdotal, it's here and there. Something really shifts in the 18th century. And one of the things we have to remember is that it's an era where literacy just absolutely starts taking off. And the most popular type of book in the 17th century and early 18th century is theology. And so printers are printing theology. What happens in 17, 15, 20 is that travel logs, travel literature becomes much more important. And people are reading more and more about the European outthrust into different parts of the world. And that's really going to be, as I said, the base material for new theories of the human species.
Well, there are travelogues, and this relates to the second piece of context, which is France as an emerging colonial power over the course of the 18th century, with Bordeaux at the epicenter. So you point out by the mid-18th century, Bordeaux is at the commercial and colonial center in some ways of France's connection to the French colonies of Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint-Domingue. Of Saint-Domingue, you write, by the 1770s, this comparatively new colony had basically become an extension of the city's economy because so many people who lived in Bordeaux owned most of the plantations in this colony. You note too that Bordeaux was involved in the slave trade and that the total number of African captives taken from Africa to the Caribbean by Bordeaux slave traders far exceeded the overall population of the city itself in 1789. Can you talk about this important piece of 18th century French history?
Yes, you've stolen my best lines. So it's important to think about the city. It's true. Why Bordeaux? Obviously, the Paris Academy of Science didn't ask this question. Paris was not linked, financially certainly, but not linked in the same way. Bordeaux had an African population, sometimes children of Africans coming to Bordeaux to become educated. Africans were involved in the trade. And certainly from the Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue, which we now know as Haiti, this monstrous colony, there was a lot of miscegenation going on in the colonies, and despite the fact that it was theoretically illegal, there were a lot of mixed children of mixed race being educated in Bordeaux. There were also a lot of enslaved Africans in Bordeaux, and I love to talk about the fact that we always say in France that there are no slaves in France, right? Slavery was legalized in 1716 by the regent after Louis XIV died, and then once again reauthorized in 1738. And so the Africans who were in Bordeaux were actually enslaved Africans, or Caribbean-born Africans who were taken to Africa, to Bordeaux. And we figured that there was probably, there were hundreds of Africans or people of African descent, working in Bordeaux sometimes at any given time. It's hard to kind of have numbers until later on in the century when they institute a police des noirs. But early on during the contest time, ship captains and ex-planters would come back with their African slaves. So why do I say this? Because blackness is a question that they see in the road, in the street on a daily basis, more so than other places. And Nantes, it would be even more so. Nantes was, of course, the big slave trading city. Bordeaux was less involved in the slave trade until much later in the century, to the 1780s. It was making so much money on the trade with Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint-Domingue that it didn't need to do the triangle that we always talk about. They had a lot of dedicated ships, dozens of ships that were dedicated to bringing materials to the islands and also bringing back, obviously, sugar and indigo and so on and so forth.
And you also point out in the introduction, Andy, that many of the members of the Academy are either directly or mostly indirectly involved in this just by living in Bordeaux and kind of being part of the economy.
Right. So if we look back at those two groups of Academy members I mentioned, the membres ordinaires and then the kind of more qualified half, I should point out that the people who are the membres ordinaires are aristocrats. Therefore, in France, they're not involved with merchant type things, right? So still in all, some of the aristocrats who are fallen on hard times, what do? They marry into a super rich bourgeois family who, is kind of like the Silicon Valley of Bordeaux in the 18th century. And fill up their coffers that way. It's not a super common story, but it happens enough. There are actually naturalists who were in Guadeloupe and corresponding members of the Academy who were involved very much in the trade as well. And it was funny because Skip Gates, it's like, Andy, you got to look around. Next time you're in Bordeaux, you got to look in the archives for these people. I know they're involved in this thing. And I'm not sure. I haven't found it so far. Sure enough, by tracking the names, looking the families, genealogies, and of course he's into that whole thing. We did, kind of figure out that there was a number of people who are actually involved in the trade. So there's just tons of money flowing back into Bordeaux because of the trade. Indirect, Montesquieu was had wine. I'm not sure if his wine went over there, but there's so many different things being sold. The economy just explodes. One of the ways you can tell is if you walk around Paris and look at a lot of 18th century buildings. There are, of course, places like Place des Victoires and Place Vendôme, where you see beautiful 18th century buildings that look like Bordeaux, but all of Bordeaux looks like that. All of it. It's pierre de taille. It's all stone buildings in a way that Paris just wasn't in the 18th century. There were 5,000 stone buildings erected in Bordeaux during the 18th century. Absolutely astonishing. It is such a beautiful city. And not only because of the slave trade or this, but certainly the economy just blossomed and lots more people moved there as well.
Let's go back to the question, which I'm going to read again because it's worth keeping in mind. And we wanted to talk about a particular word in the question. The question was from 1741. What is the physical cause of the Negro's color, the quality of the Negro's hair, and the degeneration of both Negro hair and skin? Before we talk about the various responses that you translated and edited and discussed in the introduction and in footnotes, etc. Can you tell us about the importance of this word degeneration?
Yes, I think the word degeneration is the key to this whole thing. It is such a strange term for us. The only word we have close to that is degenerate. And what is a degenerate? It's somebody who is not as good as the original kind of product, somebody who is morally dissolute. There are a lot of kind of negative things associated with somebody being a degenerate. Degeneration is a much more kind of capacious idea, and it's applied to something akin to, well, it's kind of analogous to evolution in some ways, but it's really not. It goes back to that idea I alluded to early about an original prototype group that goes into different climates and degenerates and becomes inferior to the original model, the original prototype. So it's really interesting for a scientific academy to ask a question that determines the answer that's going to win the contest, right? And what they were doing, I think, is that they did not want someone like Voltaire to say that, or a materialist, an atheist, to say, you know, this had nothing to do with an original prototype group. These are different species in the same way, you know, Cocker Spaniels and Bulldogs are different. I mean, we know that they're actually from the same place, right? But they didn't at the time. He was using, they were afraid of a kind of a zoological separation of different kinds of humans. And so that's why they asked a question like that. And most of the respondents did respect this. Not all, but most of them respected it.
Let's talk about the responses. So we have them in the book, and you talk about them. You talk about the kind of main thrusts of them in the introduction. So some of the explanations included vapors emanating from the skin. Explanations like either Adam or Eve was black, Adam was half black. Since the sun was hottest in the torrid zone, capital T, capital Z, it follows that Africans have the darkest skin. Most of the respondents wrote in Latin, some wrote in French. They cite passages from the Bible. They concoct thought experiments. The climate is often invoked. What struck you about these responses, Andy?
Well, the first thing about this is that there's no one explanation. This is a core sample of what people were thinking in 1739 and 1741. It's really interesting to think that, well, obviously, there is no precise notion of race that exists at this time. If you go into the 1770s, 1780s, something else is emerging here. But this really talks about kind of proto-racial ideas, but the fact that there's no consensus is pretty significant. That's the first thing that struck us. The second thing is that there's, you know, four kind of basic things. One is the kind of climatological explanations that we've talked about, with or without the Bible, right? Sometimes people would say Noah, 3 kids, climate, getting cooked, burned, so on and so forth. There's that kind of thing. And then sometimes we're extremely thick, 100 pages. I cut a lot of stuff, 100 pages of biblical kind of explanations with all sorts of different authorities, which got, piled into their explanations. And there are also anatomists. Well, there's one anatomist named Pierre Barrère. These were submitted anonymously, but he happened to publish his submission in 1741. So I said, wait, that's the same one, and was able to figure out what he was doing. And I've actually worked a lot on him recently because I'm writing a new version of A History of Race, which is driven by biography from Louis XIV to Jefferson. He's one of my characters. And Barrère was in Guyana for several years, where Guyana was a very small colony, but a French colony nonetheless. And there were a number of plantations there. He wasn't a plantation doctor, but he was a botanist and a surgeon and a doctor. And he went around and he when Africans in certain places, when they died, he performed autopsies on them. And his explanation was that, and this obviously does not exist in reality, that Africans had black blood and black bile. And so what's interesting about the anatomical explanations, they're completely made up, is that, number one, the Europeans were looking for something that they thought existed And they found it even though it didn't exist. The second thing is that there were echoes of this, as I said, in antiquity, problems of the interior. But here we have an empirical anatomist who was saying this in a very authoritative tone, and it was taken very seriously. Barrère is the one part of this contest, because they didn't give a prize. He essentially won the prize because his ideas were adopted that go all the way through history, right through to Thomas Jefferson, who essentially cites what Barrère is saying about Black blood. The other thing about this, which is very significant, is that we see the locus of race changing from the outside, pigmentation brought on by an accident, to something that it's physiological, interior, something deeper and more meaningful. This is actually the basis for the third group, which are the kind of proto-classifiers. And these are the people who are kind of playing around with the notion of taxonomy and human classification and race. Right now, in your heads, you have an idea of zoological races. I mean, even if you've deconstructed them because you know about DNA, which shows that race doesn't really exist. Still in all, for a long time, we heard about kind of different races determined biology. Obviously, there's no basis in science for that. But what was going on here was they were planting the seeds for the anatomists in particular, were helping the classifiers come up with much more rigid classification systems. And the two people who are cited by these essayists are Linnaeus, who makes a classification scheme called the System of Nature in 1735 that associates humans with animals. And that's a major step. Humans were called different, human varieties weren't called races. They're called nations, peoples, or they're called by their geographical name, or by varieties. Varieties is a botanical metaphor, and slowly that is being replaced by a zoological metaphor of race. Race of dogs, race of kings, bloodlines, as opposed to variety, which implies hybridization, lots of different people part from the same kind of genus. So that's kind of the big story here. And later on, people like Kant and Blumenbach will make use of these ideas as part of their classification scheme.
Yeah, this is great. So I want to talk about some of these, you call them towering figures within the Western philosophical tradition. Let's start with Voltaire, because he's less kind of maligned than some of the other ones in the sense that in his book, Candide, he mocks the competition. Can you tell us about his poking fun at this ridiculous question and its ridiculous responses?
Yes, I've been asked to go to Rome next year to talk about Voltaire. I didn't want to do it. There's a conference, and it's called Faut-il brûler Voltaire?
Must you burn Voltaire?
Are we going to cancel Voltaire? So Voltaire is an interesting person because he was fascinated by human races, particularly for anti-clerical reasons. He wanted to say these are different species in order to refute the Bible, because his day job was trying to dump on the Bible. That's what he did most of the time. And he studied the Bible and he made fun of the Bible. Still in all, what he also did is look at some of the anatomists, and he actually produced some of the most horrific racism during the 18th century. And I do say racism very carefully because it is an ideology of different categories. And he did it partially to beat up on the Bible, but I think he kind of absorbed these ideas. And when Voltaire's tongue starts darting out, it really spits fire. And so he's saying some really horrible things. Now, for the longest time, he was seen as rearguard by historians of science and historians of medicine. Why? Because the real story of 18th century science is the way it set up evolution in the 19th century. And so the historians of science would study, or from your perspective, go in this direction, study the links between 18th century thinking all the way up to Darwin. So they look at the proto-transformist people thinking that, wow, the world is dynamic, it's changing, it's moving around. If you move into a different environment, you'll change. degeneration is an idea that leads in some ways to Darwin because it shows that nature has a history. In the 18th century, up to a certain point, nature didn't have a history. People who did natural history studied animals who didn't change. Theoretically, the Earth was 5,741 years old when this contest took place. And this was sanctioned by Louis XV and everybody else. So the idea that the world could be older, that there was an idea of deep time, that the Earth would change, these ideas led to evolution. I can't tell that story tonight. But I bring this up because Voltaire was having none of it. He's like, you know what? Nothing changes. There are different species because God, so he believes in this deist God, doesn't believe in the Bible, but believes in God. God just said, I'm going to make black people, white people, yellow people, so on and so forth. He just says they did it separately, totally separate origins, and everything is fixed. And so historians of science said, he's really not important at this point. What really was important, though, is later on when polygenesis becomes much more prevalent in the 19th century. The 19th century race thinkers go back and say, Voltaire figured it out in 1731 or 1734. He was way ahead. So it's bizarrely enough, he's in the avant-garde in some ways. Now, we didn't talk about this in the book, but that's really one of the things that's really interesting about Voltaire.
Well, as you say, kind of horrifically racist views, and yet he still makes fun of the competition in Candide. Can you just talk about the red sheep?
So two things about Voltaire. First, I've talked about him as a kind of a racialized thinker, and we can kind of understand why he was doing this. At the same time, he is associated with the abolitionist movement, and he deserves credit for that too. So there's a lot of philosophers in the 18th century, my buddy Diderot, and Helvétius, Raynal, Montesquieu, they're all involved in anti-slavery thinking. Montesquieu associated with the Bordeaux Academy. He's really interesting too, in this kind of contradictory way. So Voltaire in Candide first talks about the Negro from Suriname, which is not a French colony, of course, a Dutch colony, and the fact that this person is horribly tortured and so on and so forth. And he says, it is at this price that you eat sugar in Europe. So there is an anti-slavery side to his thought as well. This is Voltaire's humanism. This is Voltaire as a humanist, as a more universal thinker. And we can find that strain of thought too. Now, the other question you asked was about how he made fun of the contest. And it is really funny because the contest, since it was not decided, was not very well known after the fact. And it did get a lot of people to kind of think about it, but there wasn't a huge prize like Rousseau won the 1751 prize at the Academy of Dijon, and that becomes like the beginning of his career. It's published. Nothing like that, really.
Published as the Discourse on Inequality.
That's
Second
right.
Discourse
Yes,
on
that's right.
Inequality.
Thank you. So it's nothing like that. But the oh, I've lost my train of thought here.
It's not like that.
Candide. Candide, yeah, right. Back to Candide. And Candide, what's important here is that Voltaire did refer to this competition. And he said he did this by relating this funny anecdote where Candide is coming back from the New World, and he's lost everything at this point. You know, he's lost everything. And he had 100 sheep that were carrying tons of gold, and now he only has one sheep left. It's this sheep that has red hair and red wool. And he arrives in Bordeaux, and he said, well, I need to go to Paris now, and there's no way I can keep this sheep. So I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to donate it to the Bordeaux Royal Academy of Sciences. So he brings the sheep over to the Bordeaux Academy, gives it to them, and what do? They quickly have a contest on the source of the red wool of the sheep. So, and in contrast to what happens in the real world, they give the award to a thinker from the north, it was Maupertuis, but no one cares about that, because he proves that 1 plus x minus means that the sheep is going to die of the mange. So it's this very, very silly anecdote that shows up in Colonial. I don't think anyone really understood that. I don't think anyone has really understood that because the contest itself really wasn't known. But when I saw that, I just hooted. So did Skip.
Yeah, yeah. I want to keep thinking about Voltaire as a way to think about some of these other, as you say, towering figures within the Western philosophical tradition, because it is striking. It certainly struck me reading this that they can at once be abolitionists, as you say, and also have deeply racist thoughts and thinking. And you mentioned, so we mentioned Montesquieu. We talked about Kant, David Hume will come up, Jefferson in the American context. And you point this out, Andy. How do we, and I asked you before, I'll ask you again publicly, how do you reconcile Kant's emancipatory thinking on the one hand with, as you say, his dark writing on non-Europeans and especially Africans? And I think, and more broadly, we talked about this too, but how does that question fit into a larger question that we're having now, particularly in America, about what to do with these white, dead Western men in the canon? Do we keep teaching them? Do we teach them and we read their views on race and racism?
Yeah, I think Kant is a good person to think of in this context. Certainly, he represents this in his, cosmopolitan thought, real emancipatory power of philosophy. He defines what the Enlightenment is. So he is in many ways synonymous with the idea of humankind coming out of its adolescence into an adulthood where it can actually look more seriously at the human condition. So he embodies the idea of Alexander Pope, the proper study of mankind as man, from a kind of philosophical perspective. Very important. At the same time, he's an anthropologist teaching at university and he develops an astonishing collection of anthropological writings. And he's really the first person to define race in a rigorous way. It's been very hard, if you think about it from a philosophical perspective, to say that races are absolute categories, right? Because there's a whole palette of different kinds of people. And Buffon, who was the king's keeper at the Jardin des Plantes, the Jardin des Plantes now is, oh no, it was a Jardin du Roi initially in the 18th century. The King's Garden is now the Jardin des Plantes. So Buffon said that there is a huge range of different people. It's impossible to really come up with separate categories and races. It's impossible. And one of the things that these philosophical thinkers wanted to do is actually come up with categories. And Kant does it in the following way. He says, if you think about the fact that a white person having who has a child with a black person produces a mulatto, well, that person is a separate and third category. So the creation of the third category actually proves the existence of the first two categories. Now, we may not, I don't think this is very philosophically rigorous myself, but this was something that really struck people, that someone was actually defining this from a philosophical point of view. Both he and Blumenbach, also Blumenbach, another thinker in Germany, were looking at these same anatomical things we're talking about that were floating around in the 1740s and 50s and 60s. And they took them in the 1770s and said, we're going to create real categories at this point. And so you may think that this doesn't really change things, but the classification structures, whether it's 4, 5, or 8 different separate human races, allows people to organize centuries of xenophobia and stereotypes in a way that never could happen before. So then you'd have these charts. Africans are like this, Asians are like this, Europeans are like this. So this is one of the things that happens, and that just keeps on going all the way into the 20th century, where these classification schemes are being used for many, many different reasons. They have a much more political power than what was going on in the 1740s during this time, where people didn't really, there's plenty of awful things going on, don't get me wrong, but this was a time where the idea of race hadn't really crystallized. What's interesting about the 1770s and 1780s, now we're coming close to the French Revolution, American Revolution, and so on and so forth, is that this is a time when there is an enlightenment discourse. I talked about the abolitionist or anti-slavery discourse happening. And for a long time, you didn't need to justify slavery because the priests and theologians are saying, well, they give up their physical freedom, but they're getting eternal salvation. And that's a pretty good deal. And that was the major kind of idea for a long time. By the 1760s and 50s, that's not working anymore. So what do the pro-slavery thinkers do? They go to the race stuff because that's going to work much more effectively. So the justification for slavery moves from religion to the African body inside Black brains, not as smart, all these different things. Climatological explanations that these people have certain tendencies and need to work. They're better off. I mean, all this stuff is linked up to the classification systems.
You say that this is a moment in which Enlightenment era thinkers made use of the rhetoric of progress and humanitarianism in order to rationalize human bondage. So we see that tension on the one hand of progress and humanism, and then human bondage on the other.
Could I pick up on something there?
Yeah.
Because just the big thing about the Enlightenment, I think in any era, I mean, how can you reduce one century to one thing? I think that, our era is going to be seen for many different things. In the 18th century, I think it's perfectly logical that people produced the Enlightenment produces multiple genealogies. And many are emancipatory and amazing. In fact, the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution in many ways paradoxically come out of the tradition of emancipation. So it's often coming from the same thinkers too. So there is a fractured and ambiguous legacy. And I don't think it's a good thing to throw out the entire Enlightenment. It doesn't make any sense because it is the most fascinating era from my perspective. And I kind of say that I study the 18th century, not the Enlightenment, right? But still in all, that current of thought is absolutely fascinating. And I think it makes sense that it generates different kinds of things and unintended things. You think about the Haitian Revolution, that partially comes out of thought that was being developed in France, but never destined for the people who actually made use of that emancipatory philosophy. People say that Raynal, who was a major anti-slavery thinker, his book was very, very important for some of the thinkers who were in Haiti. And you have to remember that there's a huge mixed race population of educated slaveholders and also thinkers in Haiti at the time.
Andy, in the interest of time, because we want to go to audience questions, thinking about the end of the 18th century where you and Lewis Gates Jr. go at the end of the book, you pose the next kind of, you would say, kind of big question posed by the Academy in 1772. So you write that in kind of response to the shifting political climate about the relationship to slavery, the Academy releases a new question in 1772, this time asking, what are the best ways of preserving Negroes from the diseases that afflict them during the crossing to the New World? And it only received 3 submissions.
Right, so we published those in the book as well. One of the things I discovered in the archives that there's a second contest, and I was stunned. First, it's really so telling to see that the preoccupations had shifted. There's no mention of slavery. It's completely decontextualized in the 1741 contest. It's about skin, but it's not really about skin. And this is why Skip, who came up with this brilliant title, I didn't, it's way more about that. But the 1772 contest admits now that slavery is something we need to talk about. And they're kind of doing something which is really bizarre, which I call enlightened slavery. They are reformers. They do not want to get rid of slavery in Bordeaux. It's so important for the economy. Not really the slave trade, but the fact that the slaves are producing all the merchandise or the commodities in the colonies. They don't want to get rid of it, but they realize that it's happening. The abolitionist movement is coming. So they're participating in this big dialogue, this big debate rather, by setting up this contest. And I think my own view is that they got very few submissions because it was a dangerous time, and I don't think the doctors wanted to associate themselves with the slave trade in an unambiguous way.
Let's talk about the other final big event, or one of there are several explosive events at the end of the 18th century, which is the French Revolution. Starts around 1789, and by 1793, both the king and queen are executed. It also leads to the deconstruction of the academy. So the academy is over.
Yes, the academy was seen as a sign of aristocratic privilege, and it sure was. It, as I said, had the king's stamp, so they got rid of it in 1793. But that was just the beginning of Bordeaux's problems, because Saint-Domingue enters a period of continued revolt. There's war with the English during the revolution, all sorts of problems, and so Bordeaux's economy suffers terribly during this time.
And the final question, you've mentioned Henry Louis Gates Jr. a lot. We valiantly tried to get him on Zoom, and he tried to be here on Zoom. So unfortunately, he couldn't be here. But I think you've received this question before in interviews, but what was it like working with such a brilliant contemporary thinker?
Yes, it's very interesting. I've got to tell you, he's a wonderful colleague. He's so generous, and we had a really great time. And he was so funny. One of the things that, in addition to the fact he's a fabulous scholar and an amazing writer, and he's got such a great instinct for packaging something like this, and putting together, it's a massive project, a translation project, and writing the essays. And we wrote for the New York Times together. We wrote for the New York Review of Books together. We did a lot of stuff together, did a lot of events. And I think in addition to all the things I might say about him as a scholar, the thing I really took away is that he's absolutely hilarious too, and so warm and kind. We had a really, really nice time talking to sometimes very big groups, and particularly since you've noticed I'm white and he's black, and we talked about that in a very kind of frank manner, which I think was really good. We talked about it all the time. He said that, we talk about these different races and stuff, I'm not black and Andy sure isn't white. He's red. Look at him. He's red. So we had a great time.
Andy, thank you so much. Can we have a big round of applause, please? Thank you. Thank you. So now we're opening up to audience questions. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. I have what must be an extremely naive and silly question, that in all this quote unquote research in the 18th century and the division of the creation of races and the creation of categories, black and white and Orientals. It's one thing to create categories, and it's another thing to make a hierarchy. So you didn't explain if they gave any justification once they say, well, whites and Africans or blacks are different. Did they give any explanation? How do we know that we're not the degenerate? The whites are not the degenerate ones, and the blacks are the superior ones. Did anyone give any? I realize it's a silly question. Did anyone give any thought to that question? Did they deal with that at all?
So there's two questions there, I think. The first is, where does kind of the hierarchy go, and how is this done? And certainly what happens is the real classifiers, the taxonomists, they take all the stereotypes, they take all the anatomy, and then they create their categories and they create a hierarchy. Clearly, they put whites at the top. In terms of the genealogy, the fact that, as I said, generally, the people who believe that there a change had happened over time, 99% of the people went from white to black. But there is one guy, and that's Georges Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, the same guy I alluded to before, who was at the King's Garden, who was a radical thinker sometimes. Now, he was the person who really had said that it went from white to black and all over the place, different colors. You couldn't classify according to him. He hated Linnaeus. But in the 1770s, he was already 71, 72 years old. He was at his house at Montbard in Burgundy, and he has a forge there. And he said, I'm going to figure out how old the earth is. So I'm going to take some metal balls, I'm going to heat them up white hot, and I'm going to measure how long it takes for them to cool, and I'm going to extrapolate the age of the earth, because clearly the earth is a chunk of the sun that got kicked out into orbit, and we're going to figure out, the regression analysis, how long it takes. So, as I said, people took the age of the earth very seriously at this point, because you're contradicting the Bible if you say something else. So he measures this thing, and he goes, oh my God, it might be like 75 or 150,000 years old. And then he looks at some fossils and goes, oh my God, it might be 1 billion years. So he starts thinking about this a lot. But he starts thinking about the fact that the earth was hot to begin with. He said, oh my gosh, if the earth was hot, then probably the first race was black. And then in the 19th century, the editor said, he's wrong in the book. I think, yes, there's one way of justifying it, which is very strange, and that is through albinism. The fact that Africans, blacks, give birth to presumably whites. And so that was proof for a number of thinkers that this was a throwback to original whiteness. Whereas you might actually think the exact opposite is true. It's proof that blacks give birth to whites. As a matter of fact, the word albino didn't exist. The word was white Negro. So albinos are hugely important for the story of race.
Thank you. Emily, any more questions? Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much. I'm afraid my question is a bit difficult, but I think we talked about it, or one of you mentioned it. I'm a teacher, and I find it very difficult to, as a white person, to talk about race, and students are becoming increasingly difficult, and a lot of them don't even want to hear about slavery, which is what I've heard in many, many teachers' rooms. And so I was wondering how, if you've thought about how to bring this into the classroom with younger kids, especially, and high schoolers in my case.
High schoolers? What
Yeah.
age? Yeah.
Yeah.
It is very hard. I mean, I wrote an article for Time magazine, why teach the history of race, which I think is, it kind of recaps some of the stuff I talk about tonight, but I do think that the history of race is critically important. And it's hard for me to react to what is it's a moral and an aesthetic and psychological objection to talking about these things. Trigger warnings and all that kind of stuff, and I'm damaged and trauma, and it's hard to argue with that, because then you put yourself in a very vulnerable position, as you know, as a teacher. So I really don't know what one does, and I think that maybe it's you may have to do it on a more collective level, as opposed to like one person, because then you're the maverick. It's not a very helpful thing. I can talk to you afterwards if you want.
Any other questions? I'm also a teacher, and but I haven't taught in many years, but what you just said made me think about why do we have to teach about race? And we think about in common times, so think about Hitler. He tried to implement a scientific theory as to why Jews were the degenerative race. So that's a recent example of why we have to continually fight that urge in people, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Nazi ideology is going into the 18th and 19th century. Gobineau, 19th century race thinker, very, very important for them as well. So yeah, I think that's one way. There's the incredible pertinence of these things. I taught a class called Histories of Race in Cheshire Maximum Security Correctional Facility in Connecticut. 16 students, 15 probably people of color. And when I hear stories like your story, I feel like, if these guys can deal with it, I mean, give me a break. And
My
And this-
Wesleyan students.
these are not Wesleyan students. So, and what was fascinating about that is there was a guy and I'm actually writing about this right now for this new project. It was there's a guy who came into class, the best student. He came into class one day and he just was like so angry. And he said, and he wasn't saying anything, just, was sitting here with his arms crossed, kind of shaking with rage. And I didn't know what was going on. And he said that, he'd known about Jim Crow, racism, the fact that, black soldiers from World War II didn't qualify for GI Bill, all this stuff. So he knew about racism. But he'd always thought that race had been around forever. And that was just kind of there. And then, after, 4 or 5 classes, like, oh my God, it just kind of happened. It's new. And he said it was funny initially. And then he said he lay in bed one night and said, oh my God, it's not funny. This thing is, first he said, it's all bullshit. It's bullshit, but in the worst way. And said, not only is it just totally untrue, but my whole life has been determined by this thing. And he came in and he was so angry. And by the end of the semester, it was better, but it was a very, very kind of moving thing. I just felt like I got kicked in the gut. And I kind of feel like, if maybe through anecdote, these days people deal with everything through anecdote. And maybe something like that could help out rather than just, feel like everything is going to be producing trauma.
But surely there's a distinction to be made between teaching the history of race and then teaching a thinker like Jefferson and his notes on Virginia, for example. I mean, that's
Yes.
a distinction we can make. So what would you say to somebody who asks you, well, what do I do? Maybe you're thinking this, here I have this thinker. In some ways, they're a great thinker because they, create this philosophical framework. And in other ways, they're incredibly racist. What do I do with the racist parts of their text? And do I teach them at all?
Yeah, I think today race history is being taught generally through an anthology. So you're kind of like, oh, racist, and you pop through. And I don't think it's terribly interesting because you kind of lose the sometimes horrific reasons why these things pop up. Or we teach slavery, but we generally don't teach them at the same time. And so, but I do think, African history, African American history, African history from an African point of view, these things all need to be taught. And if that is kind of part of general culture without necessarily doing it in a dogmatic way, then, maybe it will get better. But it's true that there's different things. There's different courses. People teach courses on slavery, and very few people teach this kind of stuff. I think it's too hard.
Hi, thank you. This is very interesting, and I noticed there's been a kind of reemergence of an interest in genetic science recently. That people like Charles Murray have been getting quite a bit of play on in the media, and in general, a kind of rising biological Darwinism seems to be fashionable, and for different reasons. Also, those who want to promote racist ideas, as well as those who are afraid of the emergence of racist ideas through genetic research, etc. And so I'm wondering if you follow this at all in connection with the history of racism and this particular story that you uncovered in the 18th century.
Yeah, so let me unpack that a little bit. First, you're referring to Charles Murray, who was very famous for the bell curve. The bell curve is a book that talked about the fact that there were populations, genetic populations that did not perform as well as others, and perhaps public policy should be, mapped onto this whole thing. He was roundly excoriated for that, but he certainly has a very receptive audience, and more so. I alluded to that little article I wrote it was a little op-ed for the Time magazine. They had to cut the comments off because I couldn't believe how racist they were. It was unbelievable. So your comment about the fact that we're in an era where this stuff is coming right back is, I think, a very important comment tonight. I thank you for that. And I think it's, getting back to, the DNA research on teaching that also is really interesting. That may be one thing we can do. It was Skip's idea to actually write an article on that for the New York Times, which we did, about the fact that they brought together this book and also the fact that race doesn't truly exist. It's a social construct, a social idea. We have to deal with the categories that exist now because the damage done to these fake categories is real. So we need to deal with that. But the biology of the whole thing is not real. And so he was responsible for the DNA part of the article, you might guess. So thanks.